Hello everyone. Today we will be studying about one of the disease commonly seen in ENT practice, which is Meniere's disease. This is a disorder of the inner ear. A quick review about inner ear. Inner ear basically consists of two parts, a bony labyrinth and a membranous labyrinth. Bony labyrinth is further divided into cochlea, semicircular canals, and the vestibule. The membranous labyrinth is composed of the cochlear duct or the membranous cochlea, the utricle, the saccule, the endolymphatic duct, semicircular ducts, and the endolymphatic sac. Meniere's disease is basically a disorder of the inner ear. Today we will be discussing these topics within our presentation, which includes why it is necessary to understand Meniere's disease, what is Meniere's disease, what are its causes, its physiology, its clinical features which helps us in diagnosis of the disease, investigations which further aids the diagnosis and the treatment. This Meniere's disease is one of the causes of a dizzy patient. Our postgraduate students would agree with me that when a patient with a vertigo walks, it becomes a diagnostic dilemma. Meniere's disease is one which has certain characteristics and if diagnosed could be treated promptly, and this is a disease which impacts not only the physical but also the mental and emotional health of the patient. So it's very important from a clinical point of view to understand the Meniere's diagnosis and then treat it. Another factor is that has a different kind of management, the Meniere's disease. So the correct diagnosis will lessen the burden on both the clinicians and the patient. Now, how do we define the Meniere's disease? Meniere's disease is, as already told, a disorder of the inner ear, one of the causes of a peripheral vestibular disorder. This is characterized by spontaneous and recurring vertigo, a fluctuating and a progressive hearing loss associated with a roaring or a whistling kind of tinnitus and oral fullness. Of these, the most disturbing symptom is that of a vertigo. One thing which has to be kept in mind is that when we say Meniere's disease, it is an entirely idiopathic condition. It does not have an underlying cause. But the same kind of clinical presentation with some kind of underlying cause is known as Meniere's syndrome. There might be this presentation may occur with some kind of etiologies like a hypothyroid disorders, viral etiology, autoimmune, some kind of trauma, inflammation, or vestibular migraine. So if you have an underlying cause with this clinical presentation, it is called Meniere's syndrome. But if you don't get any cause and a person presents to you with all these conditions, then it is termed as a Meniere's disease. We can see as in the slide here, this is a normal healthy human ear. Okay, so you have a cochlea, you have the saccules, you have the semicircular canals opening into the utricle, the endolymphatic duct, and the dilatation at the end of the endolymphatic duct is the endolymphatic sac. So in Meniere's, which is part is most affected is the saccule and the cochlea, and later on the utricles and the semicircular canals. So there is dilatation of this cochlea, the saccule, the endolymphatic duct, and finally the endolymphatic sac. If we look at the demographic profile of the Meniere's disease, the incidence is usually 4.3 lakh. It starts from second to sixth decade, but that is not only like hard and fast rule because some kind of Meniere's disease is also seen in pediatric population and often people with 65 years and above may present with such clinical presentation. It's common in both males and females. Meniere's disease is basically a unilateral disorder. When the patient comes to you, usually has a complaint of swaying on one side or tinnitus in the one side of the ear. So 85% cases are unilateral. But sometimes the 15% cases are bilateral. These bilaterality is also usually metachronous, that is one ear is affected first and later the second ear is affected, not simultaneous. The cause is 85% are also sporadic and 15% are familial. Now these 15% cases which are familial, they might have a bilateral spontaneous presentation of the Meniere's disease. One more point to be noted is initially menials does present as a unilateral disorder, but over course of time, at some point of time, the other ear may also get involved. This is the familial causes. They occur due to some genetic alterations. So this is a table showing the kind of genes which might be affected. One point common in all of them are that all these genes are somehow responsible for the iron water transport in the inner ear, the fluid in the inner ear. So any disturbance in this iron water transport might result into a Meniere's like clinical features. Next we come to the pathophysiology. Now as already told about the parts of the inner ear, so you have a scala vestibuli, a tympani, resinous membrane, basilar membrane on which rests the organ of Corti. This area is filled by endolymph, here is the perilymph and here is the perilymph. We'll go to the next slide to understand better the pathophysiology. What actually happens is this is a normal ear which has an endolymph seen in the green color, a perilymph in the blue color. So this space which is filled by endolymph, now endolymph increases, many causes would be there. The most important is either the production is more or the absorption is difficult. So usually this endolymph is formed by the stria vascularis and is absorbed in the endolymphatic duct. Whenever there is a faulty absorption or over increased production, then this endolymph starts accumulating in this potential space, and hence this there occurs stretching of the resinous membrane. Till the elasticity is present, resinous membrane stretches, but at one point it breaks away and then starts mixing of endolymph and perilymph. As we all know, endolymph has a different ionic constitution which is rich in intracellularly potassium ion, and perilymph is basically sodium ion. So there is alteration in the composition of the two fluids, and this irritates the nerves. There is sudden opening and closing of the ion gated channels which results into the symptoms of the Meniere's, mainly the inner ear symptoms, that is the vertigo and the sense and the hearing loss. With time, gradually there is release of the fluid and the pressure declines, the resinous membrane heals itself, and finally there is resolution of the symptoms. So this is the one which makes the entire Meniere's disease pathology, and because of this sequence of events also the Meniere's disease becomes a recurrent kind of disease. So I'll just read out the slide. That normal endolymph is formed from the stria vascularis. There is excessive formation of the endolymph or a defective absorption causing retained endolymph. This causes a back pressure on the resinous membrane, and then there is breakage of the membrane, mixing of the endolymph and the perilymph. And there is mixing of the endolymph and the perilymph, and with simultaneously increasing pressure, there is also dilatation of the saccule, the cochlea. One important point here which is important from the clinical point of view is that the postgraduates would understand the Henberg sign. Now this Henberg sign, there is a positive fistula sign. This fistula, when you give an alternate pressure on the tragus or via pneumatic otoscope, the patient starts having the feeling of vertigo. Although the middle ear and the mastoid is clear of disease, still he has this sign, fistula sign positive, unlike presence of an lateral semicircular canal fistula. This is a positive sign, though no fistula is present. So a false positive sign is known as Henberg sign. Again, very important from the viva point of view. So now already explained that there's the membrane again heals itself and there is resolution of the symptoms. But what happens during the progression of the disease? Ultimately, some kind of defect is always retained even after the resolution process, and this results into permanent deficits, especially in the cochlear, the inner ear cells, and hence resulting into a definite hearing loss in these patients. Now we come to the etiology. First is the defective absorption of the endolymphatic sac. This may occur when there is an ischemia of the sac which hampers the epithelium function of the sac and hence the fluid is not absorbed. Sometimes there may be increased sympathetic activity causing spasm of the internal auditory artery. There is anoxia of the stria vascularis. Because of anoxia, there is disruption of the membrane, increased permeability, and hence transudation of the fluid increases and endolymph accumulates. Another cause may be allergens. The allergens they also cause like hypersensitivity reaction. There is edema because of increased permeability, and also in order to get rid of the allergens, excessive fluid secretion occurs and that results into retained endolymphatic fluid into the inner ear. Hyperthyroidism it also causes fluid retention at the capillary level. Any kind of disease which is causing sodium and water retention in the body may also cause the same in the inner ear, leading to endolymphatic fluid accumulation, and other causes like viral and autoimmune etiologies. So all these are actually causing fluid increase and endolymphatic fluid increase in the inner ear. Hence Meniere's disease is also known as endolymphatic hydrops, where is excessive fluid, excessive endolymph in the inner ear. One point to be noted is that all these somehow are causing an increase in the endolymph, but if we don't know what is causing it, we don't have an idea why such an accumulation of fluid is there in the inner ear, only that some clinical features we are getting of Meniere's, then only we call it as a Meniere's disease. If you get some kind of pathology which is causing this kind of presentation, then it will be termed as a Meniere's syndrome. This is a very important point to remember and also a very distinguishing thing between Meniere's syndrome and Meniere's disease. Now we come to the clinical features. As already told, the most important and debilitating feature is the vertigo. So these vertigos are spontaneous and recurrent. The vertigo usually lasts more than 5 minutes but never more than 24 hours. Within a day it subsides. And these attacks are recurrent, meaning to say they can occur many times within months, years, weeks. One thing important to remember is that between the symptomatic period, the patients are completely symptom free. They do not have any disorder of the vertigo. Now, sometimes this vertigo may be associated with an aura, where patients feel suddenly that if he is having a tinnitus, there is sudden change in the quality of tinnitus or the volume of the tinnitus. He feels heaviness in the ear, and he feels like he is going to have a vertigo attack in the next near few seconds. Patients may also have other autonomic symptoms like bradycardia, palpitations, abdominal cramps, cold sweats. So all these comes under clinical features. Another thing is hearing loss. This hearing loss is usually fluctuate. It is normal, near normal in period of remission. This may, but slowly as already mentioned, because of the permanent damage to the inner ear cells, this transient hearing loss may with time become a permanent one. One more thing which few patients present with is diploacusis. That is, the patient complains of hearing same tone and same frequency at sound at two different pitches in both the ears. These patients are also intolerant to loud sounds because of recruitment phenomena, which is positive here. They don't tolerate the loud sounds, and sometimes these loud sounds can elicit a episode of vertigo, which is known as Tullio's phenomena. Very important for Viva question 2. What is Tullio's phenomena? Presence of vertigo and exposure to loud sounds. Seen in patients of Meniere's disease, also seen in third window diseases like semicircular canal dehiscence. There also patients may have vertigo because of exposure to loud sounds. Another clinical feature is tinnitus. Now, this tinnitus is usually roaring or the whistling time. It may be present during remission period too, but the patient may have continuous tinnitus in their ears. Now, the character of the tinnitus either changes or increases when there is going to be an attack, when the patient is going to have an attack. So, it is a very important component of aura. Patient also complains of oral fullness, where the patient says that there is some kind of heaviness or ear block or ear discomfort. This may be present before, during, or even after the attack. Now, there are few variants mentioned in books important for both UGs and PGs. These are the variants of Meniere's disease where one or the other symptom is more prominent, like cochlear hydrops. This is a condition where there is a blockage at ductal reunions level, so it is only which the cochlea gets dilated. So, in such patients, the inner ear symptoms related to hearing is the one which is more important. The vestibular symptoms usually don't develop, and even if they develop, they will develop at quite later stage of the disease. Second is vestibular hydrops. In this, again, the vestibular part is mainly affected. Hearing may pitch in with time. One of the very frightening complaint of Meniere's disease is drop attacks or the Tumarkin's crisis. Here, there is sudden disruption of the uterosaccular function. It is so sudden that patient's vestibulospinal reflex even fails to compensate it. In such cases, patient falls on the ground without loss of consciousness, and they feel as if someone is pushing them down. This occurs usually in the very, very later stage of the disease, where the reflexes altogether have slowed down and the crisis is very fast. Another is Lernmois syndrome. Here, the symptoms of Meniere's disease they occur in a reverse order, meaning to say, first there is progressive deterioration of the hearing, then there is attack, at which time the hearing recovers. So, these all are few points to be remembered for Viva purpose, mainly for MCQs too, and also when you write down your answers. How do we evaluate the patient of Meniere's? Patient of Meniere's usually come with the most common and debilitating complaint, that is vertigo. So when the patient comes to the OPD with the vertigo, there are few things which has to be asked regarding vertigo. Like when did the vertigo start? What is the onset? How long did the vertigo remain? What is the duration of the giddiness? How frequent does the episode occurs? How does the episode progress? Whether it relieves with time or it worsens through the day or it happens and it's gone, and what are the associated symptoms the patient is having, and is there anything which relieves or aggravates the giddiness. So all this will help us in making a diagnosis of Meniere's and also making it separate from other differential diagnoses. For say when we consider Meniere's, patient will say that I have vertigo that lasts for few minutes, sometimes they will say for the entire day, but usually not more than the day, and it is very recurrent. I mean, I'm experiencing 3 episodes a month or 4 episodes a year. Like that, they will say the number of times it's occurring. And they will also say that within the period of the symptoms, the entire period is very symptom free. That is, they recover from the symptoms and they don't have a problem. They will tell that when they have vertigo, they feel that they are going to have vertigo. That is, they kind of have an aura, or they will have bradycardia, palpitation, sweating, such kind of associated symptoms would be there. Meniere's patient usually don't give some aggravating factor, but yeah, they feel better when they lie down or sit down. Such kind of this questionnaire is applicable to all the patients who come for vertigo because that helps us to make the differentials. Like for example, when we take a patient of a BPPV, benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, such patients present to OPDs, they say that I have a vertigo and it lasts only for few seconds. 30, 60 seconds are very much, only 2 to 5 seconds it lasts. And the typical history that they give is that when I stand out from the bed or when I lie from the bed and turn my head on one side, then I have giddiness. These are the conditions, this is the history that the patient will give. And when they tie their shoes or look up, then also they have giddiness. Another patient, suppose with vestibular neuronitis. Now, these patients will come to OPD and they will look very disbalanced. They would be not able to stand on their own. When asked about other symptoms, these patients will lack any auditory complaints. They won't have any kind of auditory complaints. It's only the giddiness by which they are worried. They may have at that time proper nystagmus. And these patients, the remission period is usually from weeks to months to sometimes up to 1 year. So their giddiness lasts throughout the day, throughout the period till they are having the disease. And it is first attack that they will present with in the OPD. That is vestibular neuritis. Vestibular migraine patients. Yeah, these patients they usually, as said, they will have an aura, and the migraine, the vestibular symptoms for them would remain for about 17 to hours. That is to say 3 days, and usually they have some triggering symptoms: lack of sleep, stress, some particular kind of food, loud noise, and all these things. They may have some kind of triggering factors, and that remains for the entire 72 hours. So like that, the differential can be made based upon the history. So menias, I told you, this is how the history. The patient with menias present to the OPD. Another is hearing loss. Now the patient with menias, they usually don't say first symptom as a hearing loss. It's only when you inquire them, they said, yeah, I'm able to listen less from this particular ear. So in that also you should ask the patient about how is the onset, what is the progression, how is the severity, whether it is present continuously or episodic. They will say that when I have vertigo, I feel it is less, but during the period, symptom-free period, I hear normal. So that kind of history the patients might give. Then when they are having vertigo, at that time they will say that I have such a intense noise in my ear that I cannot hear anything. So it decreases to a greater extent during the attack. So that kind of history would help us incline more towards the Meniere's disease. Tinnitus. The patient also complains of tinnitus. Where again we have to ask the patient about how was it sudden in onset? Is it present all the time? What is the nature of the tinnitus? Whether it is pulsatile, roaring, whistling, and the aggravating factor, and how long the tinnitus remains. So this patient of Meniere's, now their tinnitus is usually remains even during the period of remission, because that is something which has irritated the nerves, and that nerve irritation is presented as tinnitus, which is difficult to heal. We can also ask patients about associated history that the patient is having, whether they are having nausea, vomiting, palpitations, any autonomic nervous system signs, which symptoms which help us to make our diagnosis again more towards Meniere's disease. Now, many a times it happens that the patient with depression, they first report to psychiatric OPD, and then they are referred to ANT because they also have a giddiness as one of the adjusting factors. So the patient with Meniere's, they also develop some kind of psychosocial impact. Now, these patients, because this Meniere's attack can occur at any time, so they are very scared to go alone. They are scared of public gatherings. It inhibits their daily life activities, and hence they often land up into depression. So such kind of histories is also important to be taken. Again, it strengthens our diagnosis of Meniere's disease. Another thing is that, as already told, Meniere's disease is something which is idiopathic. So, to rule out other causes of the same kind of clinical presentation, we need to take other comorbid histories also, whether the patient is having hypertension, diabetes, thyroid disorders, any cardiac, any CNS ailments. That kind of history should also be taken. On examination, when we see the ear membrane, the tympanic membrane is almost normal. Depending upon the age, some changes might be there, but as per related to Meniere's disease, there is no otoscopic finding. When we do a tuning fork test, Rinne's is usually positive, Weber's is centralized. Absolute bone conduction, which is a function of the bone, which is a measure of the bone conduction, it is usually normal. But when the patient is coming to you at the time of attack, you will find a sensory neural hearing loss. That is, the ABC would be decreased when compared to that of examiners. And even during the remission period, if the patient is having a history for a very long duration, then also you can have a little decreased ABC. Plus, maybe age related too. So, these findings you can get when you are doing an absolute bone conduction. When you do a fistula test, as I have mentioned in previous time, explain also Henberg's sign. It is a positive fistula test in absence of an actual fistula to seen it because of the dilated saccule pressing against the footplate of the staples. When the patient is having an acute attack and he presents to OPD at that time, nystagmus is present. Now this nystagmus when present, we can give the idea at which stage of disease the patient is, which is explained in the later slide. Then, because the patient is coming with vestibular symptom complaints, there has to be evaluation of the vestibular symptom. This includes a rhombus test and the Attenborough test. If the patient comes within the attack or within few duration during the remission period, then also you may see the patient swaying to one side, which indicates a peripheral lesion. Such patients, when subjected to positional tests like this, Hall Pikes usually is not positive because it is not position related. As vertigo is also a very important clinical presentation of the central disorder, so when the patient comes to the OPD with this kind of presentation, a thorough cranial nerve, central nerve examination and cerebellar examination is very important to rule out any central causes of vertigo. How do we diagnose menials? Now, as per American Association of Otolaryngologists and Head and Neck Society, Meniere's disease is basically classified into four: a certain, definite, probable, and possible. The certain is the one which is confirmed when you see a dilated endolymphatic hydrops finding on a histopathology. Definite is a condition where you have two or more definitive episodes lasting more than 20 minutes, and in one episode you at least have an audiometrically confirmed SNHL, sensory neural hearing loss. Patient has a tinnitus or oral fullness, and with all these you exclude other causes like there is no autoimmune, there is no trauma, there is no history of inflammation, viral etiology, endocrine disorders. Then you make a diagnosis of a definite menias. A probable diagnosis is one when you have one definite episode with a documented audiometric evidence with tinnitus, oral fullness, and other causes excluded. So the possible one is where you have an episodic vertigo without a documented hearing loss. The SNHL is a fluctuant or a fixed type, and there is a disequilibrium and other causes are excluded. The current guidelines say that there is only two kinds of Meniere's diagnosis. One is the definite and another is probable, given in the latest Scott Brown 8th edition, important for the postgraduates. A typical attack of Meniere's disease. Can be defined by the direction of spontaneous nystagmus. When there are three phases: the irritative, the paretic, and the recovery. So you have an irritative phase, the nystagmus beats towards the affected ear. In a paretic phase, because of the overcompensation from the opposite side, it beats opposite from the affected ear. And during recovery phase, as there is again resolution of the symptoms and their ruptured membrane is repaired, then again the nystagmus beats towards the affected site. The Meniere's is staged as per the degree of hearing loss. So whatever we have to take out the average of our pure tone average at pure tone audiometry average at 0.5, 1, 2 and 3 kilohertz, and then we classify them according to the degree of hearing loss as stage 1 to 4. Stage 1 is when the hearing loss is less than 25 decibels, 2 from 26 to 40, 3 from 41 to 70, and if the hearing loss is greater than 70 decibels, it becomes stage 4. Now, investigations. When the patient comes to the OPD and they are suspecting a Meniere's disease, we do order for an audiogram for such patients. Ideally, the Meniere's frequencies, audiogram, if we see, it is mainly affected upon the low frequencies, that is below 2 kilohertz. So ideally, you will see an SNHL, that is increase in the bone conduction threshold at a lower frequencies, that is less than 2 kilohertz. But this is a very typical of the Meniere's disease, and it's seen only when the patient is in attack, during the attack. But before and after such kind of audiometric finding might not be available. So when the patient comes to the OPD, we are suspecting a Meniere's disease. The ideal thing is to have a series of the audiograms and then compare. So ideally, if we go by definition, there has to be, as in the affected ear, then the contralateral ear, the bone conduction should be 30 decibels, at least 30 decibels hearing level at each of two contiguous frequencies below 2 kilohertz, as seen in this image here. This is the bone conduction of left ear below 2 hertz, that's 1000, 5000 is almost below 30 decibels then compared to the right ear. So this is a kind of typical audiogram of a Meniere's disease. If we have a bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, then absolute thresholds for bone conductance sound must be 35 decibel hearing loss or higher at each of two contiguous frequencies below 2000 Hz. And as already told, if you take a multiple audiograms, then it's important that if before, during and after the attack you compare. And if you see that after the attack there is an improvement in SNHL, then it strengthens the diagnosis of the Meniere's disease. Then is the speech audiometry. The speech audiometry is a battery of tests which is very important to know, especially if we are suspecting an SNHL, to know the site of the lesion. Speech discrimination score, where the patient can discriminate between the sounds in silent and the noisy background. How much they can differentiate, that depends upon their nerve function. For retrocochlear, it is very poorer. For cochlear, these patients, it's 55 to 85%. Meniere's disease as a cochlear disease, also known as cochlear hydrops. So here the SDS is still little better, 55 to 85% asymptomatic period, but it is impaired usually during and immediately after the exam because of the irritation of the cochlear nerves. Other tests like recruitment test, being a cochlear lesion, recruitment test is positive. So once you increase the intensity, the discrimination improves because of the recruitment phenomena, and then of course it becomes a plateau stage later because of impaired cochlear function. But recruitment, the remaining cells, they do become active. So recruitment test is positive. If we look at the CC score, which is a short increment sensitivity index score, this is better than 70% in two-thirds of the patient. Because they are not having problem in understanding, it's only the transmission that is affected. So the cochlear lesions, hence CC is also good. Tone decay test is less than the 20 decibels, which is very much higher if you see in a retrocochlear lesion test. Test for retrocochlear lesions. Then is the electronystagmography or the caloric testing. Because in Meniere's disease there is a hypofunction of labyrinth with irritative paratic and recovery test. The caloric test we have following findings. Either you can have a pure canal paresis on the affected side, or during the paratic there may be directional preponderance on the healthy side, or depending upon the stage there might be combination of the both. But important is you get an ENG finding in support of Meniere's disease with a hypoactive labyrinth. Electrocochleography. Electrocochleography is one now being considered as one of a very important tool for diagnosis of Meniere's. Various studies and literatures have shown and has been done, and finally the results have been calculated to diagnose what we can say, what is the level at which we can say it as a Meniere's disease. It can be extratympanic or the intra-transtympanic. Extratympanic is something in which we place the probe into the inner ear, into the external ear, just touching the membrane or in the external auditory canal only. And transtympanic is one which goes inside and we get the exact idea of the inner ear. So it records the sound evoked electrical activity near the cochlea. This measures by evaluating the amplitude ratio of the action potential and the summating potential which is generated by the stria vascularis. So whenever there is displacement of the basilar membrane towards the scala tympani, that the space is being increased and the basilar membrane is stretching out into the scala tympani, then there is increase in the summation potential amplitude. So because of which the ratio obviously increases. So here are the two graphs showing the summating potential and the action potential for the left ear and the right ear. And then we can, here is some literatures after various studies, they have documented this finding. So when the SP-AP ratio is greater than 0.42 in an extratympanic and greater than 0.35 in transtympanic, then we can label the vertigo occurring due to Meniere's disease. Another is glycerol test. The basic thing of this glycerol test is that this is a dehydrating agent. So when you give glycerol to a patient, it being dehydrating agent, it absorbs the endolymphatic fluid, decreases the endolymphatic pressure, and there is resolution of the symptoms. That is the basic method to do it and the principle behind it. So what we do is patient is given 1.5 milliliter per kg of glycerol with equal amount of water with some flavoring agent. The space discrimination audiogram is recorded before giving this glycerol to the patient, and then 1 to 2 hours after, and then interpretation is done. So if there is improvement of 10 decibel on two or more adjacent octaves, or there is a gain of 10% in speech discrimination score, or person feels that his tinnitus and oral fullness has relieved, then we can say that the glycerol test is positive and the patient is suffering from the Meniere's disease. Now this has also been combined with ECOG to see the lessening of the SP by AP ratio. Another is cochlear hydrops analysis masking procedure or the CHAM. This efficacy is yet to be proven, is still in the process of trial, but it works on the hypothesis that when there is dilatation of the endolymphatic system, the characteristics of the basilar membrane changes. The basilar membrane stiffens. As a result, the traveling wave, anything which is stiff, the waves will travel faster compared to when it is lost. So it is very strengthened, it is stretched out, and the waves travel faster. So when we do a stacked ABR, and we are giving some click stimulus, then this high pass noise, the high pass noise, their masking is impaired because we are not able to get those noises, so their masking is impaired, and hence this procedure will get indicated, and this test will indicate or give some idea about that the strengthening or the tightening of the basilar membrane is happening because of an endolymphatic hydrops. Very not very efficacious. It's important to when we asked sometimes in Viva, important for the postgraduates. And another is delayed MRI after gentamicin injection, whether intravenously or intratympanically. This gadolinium. Principle is that this gadolinium it enters only in perilymph and not endolymph in a normal healthy ear. But what happens when there is a mixture? You will find some traces of gadolinium also into the endolymph. Now that further dilates the endolymphatic vestibule. Through the various analysis, it is seen that for a normal individual, this dilatation is less than or equal to 33%. But if it is more than that, if contrast MRI, if you see endolymphatic vestibule dilatation greater than 33%, you may make a diagnosis of Meniere's disease. So here what is it is this gentamicin has to be given intravenously 4 hours before the MRI, or 24 hours in before if it is has to be given intratympanically, although intratympanic injection is usually not indicated because of toxicity of gadolinium. Apart from this, MRI and CT scan of relevant structures like brain, CP angle and inner ear should also be done to rule out other causes of vertigo and call it specifically as Meniere's disease. Now the treatment. Meniere's treatment is both medical and surgical. First we say reassurance, because these Meniere's patients are usually have some kind of anxiety and depression, and they are always apprehensive about the next attack. So they have to be counseled regarding that it is a treatable cause. If attack comes, they have to just lie down, sit and call someone for help, not to go alone anywhere, not to do exercises which require extra balance. All these things have to be reassured to the patient. They should not be scared of the attack. Dietary restrictions, anything which is causing the retention of the fluid in the body should be avoided. Like there should be low sodium intake, only 1.5 to 2 gram per day, not more than that. Caffeine, fluid intakes, everything should be limited. Patients should not have stress, because stress again releases corticosteroids which again cause fluid retention in the body, that is not advocated, and they should exercise on a regular basis. As already told, this Meniere's disease can have attack at any time, so they should not go for activities which require a body balance like diving, swimming, rope walking or anywhere, even driving not allowed for these patients alone. Medical management. There are two kinds. One which will reduce the endolymphatic hydrops, that is they reduce the fluid retention in the body, and second is the one to manage the vestibular symptoms. So diuretics, be it hydrochlorothiazide, acetazomide, or a combination of hydrochlorothiazide and trimetrin, which acts upon iron water transport channel, they increase the fluid, they release the fluid from the body in form of urination, and it does not allow the fluid to accumulate in the inner ear, thereby reducing endolymphatic hydrops. Vestibular symptoms, basically the agitated vestibules have to make sedated, and for that most commonly one common ones use a beta histine or the Vertin by the brand name, prochlorperazine, Stemetil, diazepam and Valium. Diazepam and Valium are usually given when you have a very acute attack of vertigo. Otherwise, for a chronic phase or for a long-term treatment, beta-histine and prochlorperazine are preferred. These they also come under the medical management, although the route is a tympanic route. Two drugs which are commonly used are the corticosteroids in the form of dexamethasone and gentamicin. Both corticosteroids and gentamicin can be given through the tympanic membrane and delivered into the round window from which it goes into the inner ear. This is the site for the injection of the intratympanic site. This you can see the handle of Malleus, the anteroinferior quadrant with the cone of flight, and this becomes the posterior inferior quadrant and hence the area of the round window membrane. Here we inject the drug and this from the round window goes into the inner ear to relieve the symptoms of Meniere's. So two drugs as already mentioned, corticosteroids and gentamicin. Corticosteroid basically reduces the inflammation and edema due to the ruptured membrane. Gentamicin is itself vestibulotoxic, so it will depress the vestibular receptors and hence decrease the symptoms of the Meniere's. But one disadvantage is that gentamicin, though more potent and better in treatment, it has a risk of sensorineural hearing loss because it is also ototoxic. Another way to deliver the drug, if you don't want repeatedly to injure the tympanic membrane through the injections, the idea is to place a microwick. Through the grommet tube, a microwick is placed inside and from this microwick, we deliver the drug which reaches the round window membrane and the inner ear. Mainly gentamicin is what which is delivered. Another recent thing is or something which is in trend is intermittent low pressure pulse therapy. This is given through a Menes device as shown here in diagram. The most important advantage is that it can be self-administered by the patient, so the repeat need for coming to hospital is avoided. So there is when the Menes device is pressed through the ESC into the tympanic membrane, there is intermittent pressure through the round window membrane. This presses the perilymph in which compresses the endolymph and redistributes the accumulated endolymph to the sac and the blood vessels and hence relieves the patient of their symptoms. Then lastly, we come to the surgical treatment of the Meniere's disease. This is divided upon two types, conservative and destructive. Conservative are the surgeries where the main aim is to preserve the hearing. Hearing is good and you just have to alleviate the vestibular symptoms. In there you can have, then you have to do a conservative surgery. First is an endolymphatic sac decompression. Endolymphatic sac decompression, we just open the endolymphatic sac and whatever the fluid is being accumulated is allowed to trickle down into the subarachnoid space. Another is endolymphatic sac is drilled out and then a shunt is placed and then the fluid again leaks out. So endolymphatic sac decompression and endolymphatic shunt placement. These are the two. And we as already told, there is a distended saccule and the saccule lies against the stapes foot plate. So sacculotomy, where we just make a hole through a needle, we go through the stapes foot plate, we make a needle into the saccule and that decompresses the saccule and relieves the patient of the procedure, of the symptoms. That is known as fix operation. Another is the Podi-Tac procedure. In this also we go through the stapes foot plate, we puncture the saccule and in that we keep a steel tube. So they constantly decompresses the saccule and keeps the patient free from the symptoms of the Meniere's disease. Another is cochleosacculotomy. In this, through the round window membrane, we puncture the cochlear duct through a curved needle and thus relieves the patient of their symptoms. Another conservative treatment is vestibular nerve section, where a selective sectioning of the vestibular nerve is done, sparing the cochlear and the facial nerves. Ultrasonic sound waves can also be used to disrupt the labyrinth, thus preserving the cochlear function. Another and last surgical treatment is the destructive surgical treatment. Here the patient's hearing has already gone, so through the transmastoid and the transcochlear approach, we can do a labyrinthectomy. So to conclude, Meniere's is very common cause of peripheral vestibular disorder. Diagnosis is made by proper history and aided tests. Most important is that other causes has to be excluded to render it as Meniere's disease, because Meniere's disease is idiopathic. Treatment can be medical and surgical. Vestibular rehabilitation therapy, though has a limited role, should be advocated in such patients to increase their threshold for the symptoms. So for that is the end of the today's topic. For undergraduates, the important thing to know is that when a short note on Meniere's disease comes, they should be well versed with the definition, the etiology, the pathogenesis, clinical features, and the management. For postgraduates, the thing which has to be kept in mind is that how to differentiate different forms of vertigo, how to see the patient in the clinics, focus on their history, examination, what are the typical findings of Meniere's disease in history, in audiometry, and then the treatment, that is the management of the Meniere's disease. Thank you.